This is where I think some of the scholarship has been really helpful in sort of noting a lot of kind of the interworkings of these books. Early on, and we're talking 19th century here, scholars began to realize that the end of some books in the Minor Prophets and the beginnings of the others used very similar vocabulary. Originally, this started in kind of like a broad form, dealing with key words, light words, dealing with these things, and seeing they noticed that a lot of the Minor Prophets use very similar vocabulary. Eventually, this developed in the work of Karl Delitzsch. Delitzsch in 1851, he published a work on Obadiah. I think it's only in German, but I'm not positive.
Hmm.
But he published a work on Obadiah and relating it to Amos. And he develops that light warts motif into something that he calls, in English, catchword chains. Stichwortverkettung is the German
There we
word
go.
for that. They just string everything
Yeah,
together.
this is synthetic language, compound words.
And so he noted that it's not just that they're using similar vocabulary, but they use similar vocabulary in a similar order at the ends and the beginnings of various books. And some of them are more than others. Amos 9 and Obadiah are kind of the key image of that in the Minor Prophets. And in fact, the sheet that I sent over to you, which you can post that, I don't mind, has a little appendix on it, outlining some of these things from the work of James Nagalski, who took Delitzsch's work and a number of others, kind of building up to them, and really flushed it out in a really helpful way, outlining how the end of Amos and the beginning of Obadiah overlap in terms of these catchword chains. Now, adding to that, and I think this is where some of the more recent developments in interbiblical interpretation and things like that can help. It's not just that these catchword chains end and begin various books, but those catchwords actually extend into the various contents of the books. And so I actually added a column to Nagalski's work, noting where a lot of these similar features kind of penetrate through the entirety of the Minor Prophets. And so the relatively recent work of interbiblical interpretation, I think, is another key aspect of digging in to this thesis, where the Minor Prophets allude to one another, right? They quote to one another, they allude to one another. They it seems like the later prophets in the Minor Prophets are reading the earlier prophets and developing on some of their material, right?
Makes
And so
total
that
sense.
I think that little appendix there is going to be really helpful for detailing that. In fact, that these intertextual links, these interbiblical links, are so prominent that one scholar, Jacob Worrell, Wohrle, published a work entitled "So Many Cross References." Just like there's so many, right? They're all over the place. They're everywhere. Even Nagalski, who's a very prominent Book of the 12 scholar, has, I think it's a chapter in a book entitled "Intertextuality in the 12," where he digs into some of these other features as well. Right. So the beginnings and the endings of the books seem to be interwoven together. Here in a little bit, I want to look at Joel with you when we're talking about the shaping of it, and I'll illustrate how important that is for the book of Joel and how it fits in to the Minor Prophets as well. All right. So these catchwords and things like that have been really important for realizing that, hey, these books, they actually have a flow to them, and they seem to be purposefully placed in certain spots within the Minor Prophets rather than just haphazardly throwing these things together.
Yeah.
Right? Another way we might see the Amos Obadiah relation. I know some of your readers are familiar with Greg Beale. One of his categories for the New Testament's use of the Old Testament might be applicable here, where it looks like, based on Nagalski's thesis, that Amos 9 provides what Beale would call a blueprint for the book of Obadiah, right? Which is where Obadiah is kind of thinking through a lot of the material in Amos 9, and it structures his thought in the book. Other pieces of evidence that scholars have put out for this, scholar Dwayne Christensen, I think it's Christensen, it's either Christensen or Christenden, argues for a cross-book chiasm between the books of Nahum and Habakkuk.
Mm.
right? So it's not just these things that are interwoven on the beginning and the ends of the books, but he's seeing a macro structural level going between two different books in the minor prophets, right? So he argues, Nahum opens in a theophonic hymn, and Habakkuk opens in a theophonic hymn. Nahum progresses into a taunt song, he calls it, against Nineveh. Habakkuk has a taunt song against the wicked one, or Babylon, in Habakkuk chapter 2. And then he has Habakkuk 1 as the center of this chiasm, dealing with the issue of theodicy. And I think that's an important kind of macro structure element to Nahum and Habakkuk, and how the minor prophets are going to work together, because the main enemy of the people of God is going to shift as the history progresses from two key parties introduced in Nahum and Habakkuk: Assyria and Babylon. And where Nahum fits in the minor prophets fits the transition from Assyria as the agent of judgment against the northern kingdom of Israel, to where it's going to shift over and start talking much more about Judah, whose agent of judgment is not going to be Assyria, but rather Babylon. Right. So the insertion of Nahum, this chiastic structure, actually is going to express redemptive historical transition in addressing the people of Israel in the northern kingdom, with Assyria as the agent of judgment, to Judah with Babylon as the agent of judgment. Paul House will take that a step further, and he actually argues for connections between Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. And he argues for a single plot structure between these three books, which I think he's right about that sort of work. So the book of Joel is another one. I've talked about that a little bit already. But just to mention here, a little whistle wetter, as we'd say in Texas, would be if you just go get a cross-reference Bible, right? Get a cross-reference Bible and look at the cross-reference columns in the book of Joel, you'll find that the book of Joel is made up almost entirely of cross-references with the minor prophets.
Mm.
Right. There are some other references to Isaiah, probably coming through other prophets, but Joel is almost entirely made up of references to other minor prophets, which is going to play a key role in how we're going to see that functioning in the shaping of the 12 later on.